Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session. We are glad to have you here with us this afternoon. This is Connecting Employee Wellbeing to Your ESG Strategy. And we're going to give everybody a minute to get into our virtual Zoom room, and then we will go ahead and get started. Thanks so much to everyone for being here today. Looks like we've got several folks joining the room. We have a good crowd joining us this afternoon, so we'll give it a few more minutes this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. So welcome everybody to Connecting Employee Wellbeing to Your ESG Strategy. Right, I see everybody coming in. Welcome everyone. We're glad that you can be with us today. Right, I see everybody coming in. We have a last few folks joining, and then we will go ahead and get started. All right, so welcome everyone to our CSR Marketplace Live. This session is Connecting Employee Wellbeing to Your ESG Strategy. My name is Erica Bader. I'm the Vice President of Content and Learning for ACCP, and we are glad that you could be here with us today. Our CSR Marketplace Live are the pre-conference sessions that we're running in conjunction with our partners in the CSR field, and we are glad to have E4E Relief with us this morning for their session. We appreciate their support of ACCP and of our conference, which will be taking place in December. So we're glad to hear from E4E Relief today. We will be using Zoom today, and I know that everybody is well versed in Zoom these days, but we do want to cover a couple of the features that we'll be using. First, we do have the live transcript turned on. So if that is helpful to you, you can see the subtitles at the bottom. If you'd rather see the full transcript, you can click that caret down at the bottom and click View Full Transcript, and that will pop up on your screen. If the subtitles are distracting, you can also turn them off from that same caret down there at the bottom. So if that's helpful to you, you have it. If it isn't, you can turn it off. We will be using the chat feature today for you to share your thoughts with attendees. Feel free to go ahead and choose all panelists and attendees. That means that everybody that's on the session today can see what you're chatting, and we welcome you to talk with your fellow attendees. So go ahead and add information into the chat. If there's things that you want to add to the discussion or share with each other, please feel free to go ahead and do that using that chat feature. We are going to be holding time at the end for Q&A. So go ahead and add your questions at any point in time during the session. We're happy to take them at any time, and we will answer them towards the end of the session. We're also using that upvote option. So you will see that thumbs up on the question. And if there's a question that's been asked that you find interesting, you can go ahead and upvote that question. And that lets us know which questions have the most interest from the audience. We are, as I mentioned, the CSR Marketplace Live is a part of our conference, which is taking place live online in December. So hopefully we will see you back with us for our conference in December. So with that, I want to introduce our speakers for today, for our conversation today. The first is Holly Welch Stubbing, who's the president and CEO of E4E Relief. And then with Holly today is Clarence Mingo, who's the VP of ESG and Corporate Affairs for the Marzetti Company. And we are thrilled to have Holly and Clarence with us today. We're going to ask them to turn their cameras on so you can see their smiling faces. And we're going to stop sharing our slides, and Holly's going to share their slides so we can jump right into the content. So just a reminder that at any point in time, go ahead and add your questions in the Q&A box, and feel free to use the chat. And with that, Holly, I will hand it off to you.
Good morning, everyone. How are you? It's great to be with you today, and looking forward to sharing this content with you. I'm hoping that you can see it at this point.
We can see it, yes.
Okay, great. Looking here for, there we go. That should get us in good shape. Want to welcome my colleague here, Clarence Mingo. It's really been a pleasure to work with him to prepare for this presentation and to get to know him even better than we already did. And so, Clarence, thank you for joining us today. We'll talk a little bit about both of us and then jump into the agenda here. I have the privilege of serving as president and CEO of E4E Relief, which is an organization focused on providing well-being and relief to individuals and employees all over the world. I have a long-time career in nonprofits and philanthropy and love to spend time with on the road back when we all did that pre-COVID, and love to spend time with kids and dogs and doing some creative things when I have a moment. Clarence, would you like to introduce yourself to the group?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks so much for the invite to be here today. Holly, really looking forward to today's session. I'll simply follow Holly's lead. I've had a career focused on public service and public policy, and in a previous life, spent time reporting out on ESG metrics, really known as something else on the government side, but very similar to what organizations are being asked to do now in this space. I love to read and read and read and read, and then read a little more. If you wrap a good movie around a great book and add on a great bike ride, you've got the sum of Clarence Mingo's private life and activities bound up. So
the making
of
a great day, it sounds like, right?
There you go.
Yeah, that's a pretty good day for me too, I have to say. All right, well, just reiterating a little bit about us, we are working very hard in the disaster and financial hardship space. We were created in response to 9/11. So we are in our 20th year of service and relief, and we now represent some 5 million employees and some other individuals and communities that we serve as well. Our mission is to empower companies and employees to respond to crisis by providing a global charitable solution in their time of need. And really what we want to talk about today, which is a topic that seems to be on everyone's minds, is employee well-being. I know I'm talking about it a lot with our team. I'm hearing our corporate partners talking about it a lot. So certainly appreciate everybody to join us to sort of combine these two components that are really important right now, which is ESG and employee well-being. And so our agenda today is kind of to talk to you a little bit about some data and research we pulled up around employee well-being, and then to use that to go into an ESG realm or context, and then to kind of wrap that up to talk about readiness and responsibility within Clarence's contact, kind of in the field, on the ground, and then some of our proprietary research, impact research, and what it's sort of showing and demonstrating how relief relates to employee well-being. So if we kind of jump in, Clarence, you ready to jump in?
I'm ready to dive, yes.
Excellent, excellent. So getting started, we want to talk a little bit about investments in employee well-being as a measurable delivery of return on investment for corporations. And so if we look at this chart here, we start, from a scenario of thinking about the state of financial well-being and work. And we know that traditional support systems of the public sector and insurance are leaving some opportunities for the private sector to either want to or need to bridge the gap. Certainly COVID-19 has been, in my opinion, the penultimate example of corporate altruism in this regard of corporations trying to make sure that their team members were taken care of in this stressful environment. But you see here survey data from Salary Finance showing stresses about money and financial stress, and stresses about financial wellness being a component factor of payroll expense for corporations. If we kind of take a little bit of a turn and talk a little bit about how people are feeling at work, the state of emotional well-being. So we saw financial well-being, we're moving into emotional here. I think we can probably have many people on the call who have their own levels of tiredness as it relates to their work the last 18 months. And so we are seeing, based on survey data, and McKinsey has conducted higher levels of exhaustion and burnout in the workplace, the pressure to work more, And, this data suggests that companies may want to do more to adjust norms and expectations to lead to these feelings. Certainly we had some of this going into COVID, but definitely has been exacerbated by the, Teams and Zoom and other environments we live in, which are so easily accessible from early in the morning to evening. And so I think these idea to pressure to work more, the stress on certain industries like supply chain, with the readiness of and the ability to work more easily at home, has made the boundaries less clear. And so one of the things we're spending time at E4E Relief really digging into is the business case for employee well-being, because there's a lot of draw on corporate responsibility and line items for expenses in this regard. And so understanding and determining, is there a valuable linkage between employee well-being and corporate business goals? One of the terrific examples that we uncovered in our research was company SAP and their Business Health Culture Index, which they've had for many, many years, well before this pandemic started in 2013. You can see there in our data here goes through 2017, but it does go on into 18, 19, and 20. And that SAP data shows that SAP made a very distinct strategy around approaching well-being as a core business strategy. And in doing that, what they wanted to measure their ROI in terms of higher employee engagement, lower turnover, and better productivity of employees. And so they wanted to see how are employees faring in terms of well-being, and then analyze that against business outcomes and well-being efforts over a period of years. And you can see there that their BHCI score from 2017 through today continues to rise, aligns with the operating profit increases for the firm. So it's just, kind of three examples: financial wellness, employee wellness, and, this example of employee wellness. And so if we stop and we say, Clarence, what have you seen at T. Marzetti in financial, employee, and emotional well-being brought to the forefront in terms of your leadership and your C-suite leadership discussion over the last year?
Yeah, let me go back just a little bit, Holly, to the pandemic. And listen, we've always tracked historically. I think Wall Street at least has always tracked historically to some degree. Employee wellness metrics. There's always been concern about the stability of a company relative to the health of its employees. The pandemic really revolutionized that. When you think about ESG, we've always paid a lot of attention to the E, paid a lot of attention to the G, meaning how companies are led, how boards are comprised, and the educational and competency of the board. But the S during the pandemic really rose to prominence. And part of that was because investors needed to know that companies were taking care of their employees. And that, of course, ensures that that company, even through the pandemic, has a greater level of resiliency and capability to endure very difficult market conditions. But in addition to the investor, right, that's one class of stakeholder. Another class of stakeholders stepped in and said, hey, we're really concerned about the employees' well-being of companies. And that would be customers, right? I mean, there's certainly a customer nexus to wanting to make sure that organizations that are putting products on the shelves, goods in stores, are actually caring for their employees. So it's really interesting how the pandemic sort of drove these two classes of stakeholders to really major in the S category where ESG is concerned. We, of course, have followed suit and we're really sort of on this path a couple of years in advance of the pandemic. But from financial counseling to tuition assistance to commuter benefits, 8 weeks of paid leave, expanded healthcare, and even more prominently our partnership with E4E and our employee assistance program, where we're literally able to give financial grants to our employees in difficult circumstances. All of that reflects in our own organization a revolution around wanting to make sure we're just not paying our employees, but we're actually taking care of them certainly good for our profitability, but from a moral standpoint, we recognize we owe it. We have a duty to our employees to consider them well beyond what they do 8 to 5 and to make sure we can be supportive of the other things happening in their life. Really think of them as an extension of our business family and not just an employee.
Right. And I think, Clarence, your leadership in this space and your identification of the revolution as it relates to the S is a great segue into our next section of the presentation, which is linking well-being and environmental, social, and governmental factors. And so let's get into that and let's talk about it a little bit. A lot of folks on this call are probably experts in the space. And so this is information that, we share with you just as a setup and context as we head into some of our data. But we know that in the social, environmental, and governance realm, we think of them as sort of people, planet, and profit and the linkage between those. And we also think about the principles of ESG and these are the kind of high level working areas underneath these buckets. And as you identified, the S sleeve has taken a decidedly upward tick, in COVID and in a what may be sometime a post-COVID world. And so this idea of thinking about all of your stakeholders, including your employees, the conditions that they're in, how you work in communities and relate to communities, how you treat, your team in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and the health and safety of workforce is the key driver of the social realm within ESG. And so the factors that arise in the relationship between a company and its people or institutions kind of includes these things. And you do see, I think, people really trying to, to your point about Wall Street and the investment community, they're trying to figure out what does success look like in the S quotient. The environmental one has been well heeled for a long time, a lot of pretty well heeled metrics there. Governance, as you noted, has been easier to see. We see whether you have a governance structure that is diverse in gender and race and ethnicity, or in your employee team. But these principles here in the S quotient have been harder to measure over time and harder to know what success looks like. And it seems like people are really investing in that at this time.
And Holly, if I could add a little asterisk to your comments, as we look at these principles, whether it's relative to the E, in this case the S, and certainly the G, we spent the last 25 years talking about CSR, corporate social responsibility, and what's really distinct between ESG and CSR is, whereas CSR really gets to accountability, right? Organizations demonstrating a level of accountability to its stakeholders and reporting out about what that accountability looks like. ESG dives a little deeper and really gets into measuring, right? It gets into measuring the consequence of that accountability, both qualitatively and quantitatively. And so, when I think about the S, for as much as the corporate America's talked about what it's doing for its associates and how it's caring for its employees, it's great to talk about, but it's a whole nother set of indicators to be able to measure that with metrics, to be able to demonstrate with data exactly what the consequence of your care for your employees looks like. So, ESG is really proving that if you're an organization that says you care for your employees, ESG makes you prove that. It makes you validate that with a measurement, with a metric that is then disclosed. And I think there's really a higher sense of accountability, and the good of that goes straight to the employee, who gets the benefit of that higher degree of accountability, with the company doing and being exactly what it said it would do, and doing exactly and being exactly who they said they would be.
I think that's a great add, and agree with that very much. And think the clarification between the two is also really helpful as we kind of go into this next stage. So obviously for our purposes today, we're not talking about policymakers, the stakeholders, or community organizations. We are focused a little bit more directly on employees and contractors in this S conversation. But there's, to your point, Clarence, when we think about really taking that next step and diving in and having metrics across your stakeholder base, it looks pretty different, than it might have in the past. And so if we're focusing on that employee side of it, and we say, well, what is the linkage between well-being and engagement, loyalty, and productivity? We do see, lots of data and research on this around. We picked one piece of this to share with you today, just because it relates to sort of the future of the workforce, and that is that millennials really care about this issue, and they consider where they're going to work based on what you have uncovered and how much you've worked on your ESG criteria. And so that's something, as we think as strategists, and look at trends for future organizational development, and this becomes a key component of being able to recruit talent, keep the talent, and have them be well, within the context of our overall systems and functions. Anything else you would add there, Clarence?
Yeah, there'd be no need to go back to the slide just before this one. But there you go. So when we were looking at this, this list of stakeholders, it's really interesting, Holly, how the drivers in this current era we're living in, sort of post pandemic, if you will, the drivers around employee wellness really have been other stakeholders. So when we think about employees, consumers and shareholders and policymakers really looked at organizations and said, hey, we need you to consider how you're going to help your employee base navigate this very difficult circumstance we're facing. And I think that trend of employee wellness, sort of the arc of it, which we're experiencing now, would have happened over time. But it's just interesting sort of to see what the drivers have been. Another class of stakeholders looking back at employees and saying, listen, we owe it to you to make sure you're well. Company did that, consumers did that, policymakers did that, and shareholders expect it. And it's a great time, I think, for employees to really receive their just due and recognition, keeping the economy stable, keeping businesses alive, and taking care of our families. So interesting trend there.
The linkage between the shareholder push for this, the market-based push with consumer is so direct, and I think is so important when we consider where we might be going with this over the long haul. If you look at what's happened in other parts of the world in relationship to ESG and how it's influenced policy and how policy has shifted and changed in other parts of the world. And, we have that, as you noted, we have that from the standpoint of the SEC now, but a lot of conversation going on right now about how to, what are the metrics, what are the appropriate metrics that companies should have in this regard. So the push-pull here between these groups is essentially why we're sitting here, I think, to your point, because they have allowed us to have this conversation, for it to be relevant. But certainly, COVID also really pushed that through. So we talked about millennials and young folks and how important they think this is. One of the things that I have really spent a lot of time thinking about the last few years is customer experience, end-to-end customer experience, in the places I've worked. And so I was curious when we started looking at this subject, how employee well-being and engagement contributes to a positive customer experience. And as it turns out, a lot of research there on the absolute direct linkage between employee well-being, employee engagement and productivity, and to the delivery of a customer journey that is what we all aspire to be. So we do have multiple examples of employee well-being connected to this idea of a great customer experience.
Holly, I would add to that too. So we're in the manufacturing segment. We're a food manufacturer, retailer as well. And we've got, a number of plants, so probably over 10 plants across several states, East Coast to West Coast. And it, as a point of fact, it is, and we understand this now to a degree that maybe we didn't fully appreciate just prior to the pandemic. But our ability to understand and to support our employees through all manner of life challenges. I mean, we can see the difference between our employees knowing if you're facing an eviction, if there's a medical crisis, if there's been a horrific automobile accident, and the mountain right for that employee can be significant. And then when you add on that the financial with those various life circumstances, that employee knowing that we are there in the background with financial and philanthropic resources to be supportive in a very direct way, such that real impact comes or real financial relief comes to that employee, that's a difference maker relative to that employee's life, relative to their time on the job, and then holistically, right? Their ability to carry on for the good of the company, for the good of their family. That's, there's value in that type of partnership where the employee is just not someone we know at work, but there's someone who's a part of our business family and we're thoughtful of, well beyond what happens 8 to 5 in the workplace.
Thank you for sharing that. One of the things you shared with our team when we were preparing for this session was essentially a story about an employee or employees who have had their funeral expenses covered by your program, and how meaningful that ended up being for you, and how they talked about how that made them feel, and you said to me personally that it was one of those things that just lasts for years. Like it's something that they literally never forget because of the trauma, and depending upon the circumstances around the death or whatever was going on, that support was almost a differentiator. So I don't know if you want to say any more about that, but just track it was really moving to me to hear that was the output, because but we know when we hear from people constantly, we get notes, but we don't understand fully what the impact is sometimes.
Yeah, there's as we talked about, there's a business case for employee wellness and well-being. We can put a pin in that. We all agree. But beyond that business case, there is a bona fide relationship. It can't quite be quantified, but aspects of that relationship I'm trying to describe between employer and employee really involves loyalty. It involves commitment in an era where turnover rates for certain aspects of the economy are sky high. If you're taking care of your employees and they sense that, and they see it and they realize it, maybe they're not even the beneficiary of it, but if they know the young lady or the young man who works across from them was the recipient of the type of help and aid needed to help them navigate a circumstance that had nothing to do with work, but the organization was there for them, that type of thing, it breeds a measure of loyalty and fidelity, and really creates a relationship that helps mitigate issues that companies are facing right now, like very high turnover rate. And that's not the motive for these programs, as we know, but it's certainly a consequence of it. And it's a consequence such that, when you have to report to investors what your turnover rate is, or when you have to report to a large customer who wants to know you have the ability to deliver goods and thus wants to know what your turnover rate is, it's great to be able to point to the things you're doing to mitigate that particular issue. So again, you can do it for morally, but there's also a business aspect to it. At the end of the day, the employee is the recipient of this type of engagement and partnership. And it's a win for the company, for the employee, customers, investors, and on down the stakeholder chain.
Excellent. Well, let's keep talking a little bit more here. So we've just mentioned loyalty. And here are some information around organizational care as it relates to employee wellness. And, as you've noted, being there for your employees when they need it most creates a sense of loyalty between the employee and the organization, which therefore is both the right thing to do, but also impacts the bottom line in various ways. So if we look at productivity and well-being, and we look here, our sort of sources for this in terms of salary, finance, and entrepreneur, we see that employees surveyed report losing 1 to 5 hours of work time each week due to stress, money worries, and other wellness issues. I think one of the things that we're starting to see a lot more of, we've had it for years, but we're seeing different uses, Clarence, related to mental health. So relief programs in relationship to wellness and mental health in all of its capacities, whether that's counseling, psychotherapy, transport to those places, whatever those things are. Are you seeing changes in your well-being structure and approach there based on mental health challenges of your workforce?
Yeah, it's a great question, Holly. We are, and a terrific response we've had to it, and this really leverages technology and ease of access. But that would be telemedicine. We've now made it possible for all of our associates across our footprint, by dialing 7 digits, depending on where they live, to access the right type of professional to help them navigate the various challenges, be it physical, mental, or otherwise. We also enrolled in a fantastic program called Cancer Bridge, so that anyone in our organization, anyone in their family, any associate with a family member that's suffering from cancer can connect with this Cancer Bridge and really get the type of information that might be hard to have a long-winded conversation with your doctor about, but you can get sort of a degree, a level of information about cancer, the different phases of it, the emotional challenges and different responses and paths to manage that. It's a wonderful program, and I like this body of activity because it's real life. Listen, when you can't make your car payment, right? When you can't make your car payment, when your rent's due or your mortgage is due, and it's 3 days before you're paid, and you're struggling to figure out what you're going to do about that and provide the kids with lunch money, those are real problems. And people don't show up at work and talk about it, but we know if actually people are enduring that. And so if we can relieve them of the stresses that go along with those types of experiences, we're all the better for it. The employee is all the better for it. So we're just mitigating risk, reducing stress, and really making it possible for our employee to be better 8 to 5 on the job, less stressed after the job, and otherwise having a better life, and as much as we can be a part of it.
Terrific. Thanks for sharing that. So, we've talked about this in a couple different ways, but I did want to mention this survey because when we got into preparing for this, I just found it so interesting. So I wanted to share it with this group. It was a London School of Economic Business study on the positive correlation between employee satisfaction and firm performance. And it was, what I loved about the information, it was a meta-analysis of 339 individual studies by Gallup. And what was covered in that was almost 2 million employees and 82,000 business units. And so we're talking about a lot of data feeding this one chart here, showing you a positive correlation between satisfaction, productivity, and performance. And it essentially said that back to this loyalty point, Clarence, that there was a substantial positive correlation with customer loyalty and a substantial negative correlation with staff turnover. When your employee well-being efforts are right at the right time, in the right moment, the right way. And so I think people are so focused on this right now that I thought it was kind of an interesting thing. If you're looking for the business case, if you're thinking, if you're in the space of CSR, HR, and you're looking for a way to, make the business case for this internally, this was just a nod to try to give you a little bit of information and data in that regard. So you have given us a lot of data as we have gone along, but I think one thing that we would like to talk to you about specifically, given that we're talking about the S column here, would you be willing to share with us how your diversity and inclusion efforts fit into the body of work related to the social profile? And if so, how do you measure success in it, given exactly what you said early on about how difficult it's been to try to put programs out there that people could really get their teeth into and measure success.
Yeah, I'll be brief for the sake of time on this point, Holly, but the idea of employee well-being, there's sort of two paths to it. There's a very broad path of programs and activity, many of which we've discussed that every employee should be the beneficiary of. But even as you get down that path, there are a multitude of other paths that sort of branch off. And those branches are really considerate of the idea that not every employee, even in the middle of a common problem, is similarly situated to someone else. A good example would be the pandemic. We know that minority populations were impacted with COVID-19 to a different degree than other populations. And so companies found themselves strategizing about, okay, how can we take note of that and maybe amp up the level of communication, the degree of engagement, the degree of education around a number of things to ensure that that employee group, be it Black, Latino, Asian, or otherwise, how can we make sure those populations are receiving the level of programming needed, but that's also specific to those communities. The idea that wellness across the board is this sort of transcendent idea, and it's just sort of painted all one color. Not quite the case, because circumstances, as we saw during the pandemic, can impact people differently. The goal is to make sure everyone benefits and receives value from this, but also to recognize the consequence of the pandemic as experienced by a working mom, a little different than the consequence of experienced by a dad, right? So these are things to think about, and as people think about strategizing around employee wellness, not saying you have to create silos of employees, but you do very strategically want to be thoughtful about how that level of programming and benefit plays out relative to gender, race, disability, and the like.
Excellent. Are there measures of success that you've been able to put in place in this regard that would be relevant to share here?
Yeah, so here's one, and I think this will be very much part of the future for whether you're a publicly traded organization or not. I think this is coming. I think it's necessary. But pay equity, right? This idea of pay equity, the idea that your organization is going to undertake a study to ensure that the pay scales across all groups reflects the work being performed by each individual without disparity. I cannot tell you how important that level of activity is. It's very much a form of wellness and financial guarantee for those associates, no matter their skin color, socioeconomic status, or political affiliation. Just making sure there's equity in that space is a form of wellness. I would also tell you, the idea of standing up, for instance, employee resource groups that create space, time with company resources to have dialogue about the types of wellness programming they might need, right? If it's a group of veterans, if it's a group of African Americans or a group of women, allowing management, allowing company leaders to have an employee-inspired dialogue and path to communicate how those wellness initiatives are impacting them, or what barriers to accessing those wellness initiatives might be matters. Let me give you just one quick example. Holly, we've got a multitude of plants, as I mentioned, across the states. Some of those plants, the work base may be predominantly African American, or perhaps predominantly Latino, or hypothetically perhaps predominantly women. Because they work in a manufacturing setting, accessing these programs that I've referred to may be a little different, right? These individuals are not sitting in front of a Windows screen, and they can't click on SharePoint, and they can't access or receive the same level of information about how these programs function. So even communicating these programs, depending on where people work, maybe they're not fully fluent in English, right? So ensuring that there is a path for those individuals, whether the language is Spanish or otherwise, ensuring that there's a way to communicate the idea that the program exists with the same measure of impact, all of that matters. So we just really need to be thoughtful about how we're communicating across the board, and how people experience challenges differently, and then laying over top of that the strategies for wellness.
I think that's excellent. And it's a great point. I mean, thinking of DEI efforts as a master strategy, but recognizing that we've got to go deeper than that with the groups and make it relevant to create inclusivity and equity, in the right way. Otherwise, it's just the broad brush strokes. You won't get you over the finish line, it sounds like, in your opinion. And I think that makes a lot of sense. All right, so moving into our final section here on readiness and responsibility, which we're saying being ready and being responsible equals a well staff. In our case, we think that delivers relief that matters for our organization and for the employee base that we are supporting. Obviously, for 2020, we have seen this idea of the rise of employee assistance and relief at the forefront. Corporations, industry associations, and other groups stepped up to provide basic life necessities with grants to individuals, and contributions to relief funds that we manage grew almost 1,000% in 2020. And of the, in our research of the US-based companies with 2,500 employees who have $50 million or more in revenue, 30% of those today have employee relief programs established. And our research that we wanted to share, we just have a couple slides here to show you kind of this idea of well-being and social impact. I know this is primarily an audience of CSR professionals. And so what's nice about speaking with you is that we can talk about both the social impact piece and the social realm and the business impact. So if we look at our survey data, it's from 2020, and we had over 8,000 survey responses, completed survey responses to this data that demonstrated time and time again that employees had more breathing room and felt less stressed after their award, and that it allowed them the opportunity to figure out next steps based on what was going on. And that could be everything from a house fire to a COVID-19 grant to a frontline healthcare worker program we have called Brave of Heart that works for survivor families of frontline healthcare workers who passed away during COVID. Could have been any of these things. But one of the things we thought was particularly interesting is that the relief grant made them feel less alone. I mean, this is a very important statistic as it relates to mental health. And so when you combine those things with negative consequences that are avoided post-grant, i.e. late fees, utility shutoffs or disruptions, evictions, and then of changing your food choices. These together combine a scenario where, one hopes you come out the other side with a more well employee population with these two things.
Hey, Holly, may I quickly add, one of the things I've just absolutely loved about our partnership with E4E has simply been listening to employees discuss a crisis and then being able to respond, right? Being able to respond, not with illusory financial resources, but real financial resources to help alleviate a problem. Like, these are real dollars that will go to pay that expense, that will go to literally alleviate the crushing burden of financial pressures that can keep you up at night if you can't afford to pay for a medical bill, or if you've been in a terrible car accident and you just don't have the resources to make it all together, or maybe it's been a natural disaster. Whatever the case is, that our partnership with E4E has really allowed us to be impactful to our employees in a real tangible way. And you really can't put a price tag on the value that our company and more importantly our employees are receiving because of this partnership. So that's been wonderful.
Thank you for saying that. I think one of the reasons we labeled this section readiness plus responsibility is that this idea of allowing leaders, corporate leaders in jobs like you're in, C-suite leaders, the idea of being ready for the next crisis on behalf of their people and just having an answer for them, to your point, it gets you pretty far down the road. And then when you pair that with the fact that there's actual cash grants there, that's the delivery of that in a responsible way is sort of what we're shooting for. So it's good to hear that that's resonating with your folks. We just wanted to highlight here a couple of key examples of folks that did things during the pandemic and or after in relationship to those. And that, one of the flagship programs, in addition to T. Marzetti, is the Take Care Relief Fund at Marriott, which is worldwide and has had numerous opportunities to respond to climate-related disasters, to some COVID efforts, and to some specific issues that may come up in particular communities across where you see Marriott properties. And so this idea of taking their work and putting it back into their CSR and ESG reporting as a key component of the metric associated with their work is, I would say, a shift. Clarence, I don't know if you agree with this, but maybe over the last 3 to 4 years, we're starting to see, as ESG reports come to the fore, people start to think, well, what are the key drivers in ESG, and what are the key metrics? People are seeing employee relief programs and well-being programs as a support mechanism for those metrics.
That's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
So I think we wanted to wrap up with you on a question about well-being at T. Marzetti and just say, are there any other examples? You've shared several. They've been terrific examples in the last 2 years that allowed you to be ready and responsible for that next crisis.
Yeah, and again, Holly, just for the sake of time, I won't quickly go back through that list, but I will say, to those listening, if you're in this space, this idea of employee well-being and wellness, this is something you absolutely can love doing. If the C-suite really doesn't understand it, it's well worth it. Take the time, present the data, and make sure it's just well understood that one of the best things an organization can do right now, in a time of high turnover, very competitive market, is really gin up these employee wellness well-being programs. Practically, it's right. Morally, it's right. Profitability-wise, as Holly's already demonstrated, definitely a nexus to a company having better resiliency when their employees are taken care of. So this is possible. It's doable. Love it. Absolutely love it if you do it. Lots of value in this.
All right. Well, I think, Erica, we're finally to Q&A.
Yes, we are. We have only time for a question or two, but actually one of them piggybacks on what you were just talking about, Clarence, and that's gaining leadership buy-in for these programs. Can you talk a little bit more about, how you were able to do that, or suggestions you might have for others looking to kind of convince the leadership of the value of these programs?
Yep. So quickly, Erica, if leadership doesn't understand this, if it's a publicly traded company, I would always look back to Wall Street, right? There are standards and frameworks that investors are now encouraging companies to adopt. And these standards and frameworks ask a multitude of questions, but among those questions essentially is, I'm saying this in generic form, among those questions is, how are you taking care of your employees? Demonstrate that. What are the metrics of your giving, of your employee relief program? What's the approval rate? What's the dollar amount given, both high and low? How does that impact turnover? Can you draw a correlation there? So turn to Wall Street, look at these standards and frameworks, and really leverage those as the path and driver to get management to understand investors want this. We should be reporting out on it. To report out on it, we got to do it. We got to do it.
Erica, maybe that's something E4E can pull together, for a future session, is what are those standards and frameworks? What are those questions, and how might it influence it?
Right.
We'd be happy to do that.
Great. So I'm going to ask one more question before we wrap, and this is again right in line with what you were talking about. But it was a question about companies shifting from CSR to ESG strategies. Clarence, you talked about that. Do you see companies making that shift, or is it more blending the two with ESG helping in creating and measuring those metrics?
Yeah, I think the shift is definitely happening, and I think ultimately this will really pan out to be a blend. It's impossible now to write a CSR report without having metrics in it. You really need to demonstrate that you're being who you say you are, with a metric, some measurement of that in our case, we're driving towards assurance. If we're going to release ESG data, we want an assurance process or an audit process around that to make sure what we're giving to the public is actually the truth. And that's why I love ESG. It's just ramps up accountability, but also make sure truth is on the paper, not just in paragraph or words, but also in metrics that can be verified.
Yep. So true. Well, Holly and Clarence, I want to thank you so much for being here with us. Our kickoff session to the CSR Marketplace Live. I want to thank Holly and E4E Relief's support of ACCP, and Clarence, your time and expertise today. We did drop a link to a survey in the chat, so if you would take a minute and fill that out, that's helpful for all of us. And we will be sending through a recording of the session with the transcript and any other related materials. Look for those next week, so you will have those in your inbox. So thank you everyone for joining us, and Holly and Clarence, thank you again for your time today.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
All
Take
right,
care,
bye
everyone.
everyone.
Bye-bye.